Business Council for Sustainable Development. Again, it's an organization mostly made up by large global companies. And they define it and define all these definitions, and I'll talk only a little bit about it. They define it. It's a core business, it's for profit, has a social impact. So this one here, the very early one, it says it's beyond philanthropy, it's more than that. And they do it in commercially viable ways. That means they're making a profit out of this. IFC, the World Bank Group private sector, and then also went into this, and they defined it in a way which you will find is very simple. It's always the same terms that come out. It's commercially viable, and they're looking here at like consumers, retailers, suppliers, and distributors in their core business. ADB as well, Armin is here, so we will talk a little bit more about his definition. It's a little bit different because he's putting in some new words in there. And one word is scale. So definitely we're talking about like large size, meaning large impact. We're talking about innovation, and we're talking about systemic solutions, and I will come to this a little bit later, what that could mean. And I just put ... in there because you will find many, many definitions of inclusive business. But the core is always the same. Every organization has a little bit, some put a little bit more in environmental sustainability, some a little bit more there, some a little bit more there, some include value chain, but it's basically the core is always the same. So after 2005, what happened? There's a lot of like movements happening around. Companies were innovating, companies getting into this market, and then policymakers starting to take notice. And this year especially was a real breakthrough, as on the highest level of policy making, inclusive business, the term, and the concept behind it was further developed and included. So we have here the G20, so the 20 largest economies of the world, come together recognizing inclusive business as particularly important for sustainable development. So this means inclusive business has now reached that stage where leaders of G20 are talking about it. But we don't have to look that far, because we've got here one of the breakthroughs in the region. APEC also discovered inclusive business. They put it into their ministerial statement, and I would like to acknowledge Sasa from the Board of Investment over there. I was with her in the team that worked with APEC on drafting this together with Armin. So we're finding some of our work in this ministerial statement, which I have to say was quite satisfying to see after working until 4 o'clock in the morning to get it in time there for them to discuss. So it means policymakers have taken notice. They see it as a very valuable and important development, that the private sector is taking interest in development, and the term they're using is inclusive business. It's important that stressing that it's important to use the same words. You've got like social entrepreneurship, you've got social business, you've got like different things, and if everybody talks about different terms and terminology, it becomes difficult then to push policymakers of doing something. So we're very glad that they have all settled now on inclusive business. We have also international organizations like the World Economic Forum, who has started here in the region, the Grow Asia. It's a support initiative for inclusive agribusinesses. So the discussion we had earlier on like about sector-specific thoughts is happening. So especially here for agri, and they started in Vietnam, and they've now come to the Philippines. They're working with the government and all the stakeholders here to develop an enabling environment for inclusive agribusinesses. So I picked out like some of those sort of key concepts that are appearing. It is sort of sector and mode of engagement agnostic, so it is only like specific in one sector. However, when you analyze the different sectors, we find most. I didn't say anything wrong, did I? So you find most inclusive businesses in the agri scene because of two things. First, This is where the biggest need is. Most of poverty in Southeast Asia is in the rural areas, but also because there is the biggest opportunity to generate jobs at scale. Mode of engagement, as we've seen in one of the earlier definitions, it's about engaging the base of the pyramid, the poor low-income population, as a supplier. So this is when you work with the agri scene, you're buying from poor farmers, and you're working with them, you're helping them, you're supporting them with technical assistance and finance and so on. Also, you're developing and providing relevant and affordable products and services for them, so it's the engagement as a consumer. Then you've got the engagement as a distributor and as an employee. Financial viability of the company itself, and this is where IB started to diverge from the social entrepreneurship definition, depending on which definition you look at. And for IB, it is absolutely core that you're making money with this. Otherwise, you're not an inclusive business or not inclusive business venture. Core business model, so you're doing it not part of your CSR, philanthropy, or on the side. It's really like the key of your supply chain, the key of your consumer outreach. It is part of your normal business operation. Social impact, and this is when then sort of we are getting a little bit more into the definitions. What is social impact? All of them have to have social impact to be called an inclusive business, and there are different ways how you can measure that in terms of the scale, the reach, and the depth, and I will come back to that a little bit later. And this sort of systemic impact and innovation part. So these themes, they will come up a little bit later. So what do we have in the Philippines? We've got an agri-business, we've got interesting companies, Canada Foods in the cacao industry engaging with 20,000 farmers. Rocky Mountain Arabica Coffee talking to engaging 10,000 farmers. So it's a really large size operations. We've got Nestle who's scaling up their supply of Robusta coffee from 20 to 70,000 farmers. So it's really profound what is happening out there. Housing, the same. You've got socialized housing here, which until, I would say 2 or 3 years was a compliance issue, and the issue was that nobody complied. And it was only when BOI started to enforce compliance that companies then started to take this seriously and started to either do it within their normal operation, or they set up specific companies. Like the Villar Group set up Lumina specifically to do socialized housing, and they have targets to reach 8,000 houses per year, and they have to do it profitably. So this is an example how regulation or enforcement of regulation of a government can actually enable inclusive businesses, whereas enable was a bit of nudging and pushing, but that sometimes is necessary. And we've got in tourism a nice example of El Nido, a new development there, or the new development of El Nido, the Ayala Group, who's also a nice example of inclusive business in tourism, which not only has a lot of employees from the region, but they also have all their sourcing set up locally, engaging with the farmers there, bringing good and fresh food. So, what is social enterprise? I left this blank because this is your job. And I talked to Danny about earlier, so what was your agreement on social enterprise definition? And he said to me, well, we didn't talk about it, it's too complicated. So I think that is one of the issues of social entrepreneurship, that nobody really wants to put it down and define it for the country, for the sector, and so on. So I think I have to leave that blank, Danny, unless you come up with anything on the spot that we can put in there. But we don't need it now because we are showing you some ways. I mentioned already G20. G20 not only said that they want to work on inclusive business, work with inclusive business, but actually work with the international organizations to develop a framework. And this framework is where inclusive business and social entrepreneurship meet. Because what they have done, they've just included social entrepreneurship into the inclusive business umbrella. So what they have done is they have said they've got inclusive business models, inclusive business activities, and social enterprise initiatives. And they have some things in common and some things are different. The peer-to-peer relationship to the business in an inclusive business model, it's a core value chain. This is Canada. Most of their cacao comes from those small farmers. Inclusive business activities, ancillary. This example for this one would, for example, be Jollibee. Jollibee has an inclusive business model to source onions. So they already source 20% of their onion demand from small farmers through their farmer entrepreneurship program, which is, in terms of onions, a very big percentage. However, in terms of the total purchasing, it's rather small. So this would fall more under the definition of an inclusive business activity. And then you've got social enterprise activities who can be ancillary or core, but mostly they would be core because the social enterprise has one of the definitions that I like, out of the mission to have a social impact. Therefore, they always engage the BOP as their prime partner. Financial return, and this is where probably Armin will talk a little bit more as from a banker's perspective. In an inclusive business, you expect market returns. This is high profits. You invest in it, you're expecting dividends, you're expecting that your loan is being repaid in time, and you're not very patient. Inclusive business activities, this can be profitable, but it also must not be profitable, depending on how you structure it. You can also say you don't want to make an extra profit, or you don't want to save costs, but you're happy to pay the normal market rate for your produce, but you're supporting the farmers to be able to supply to you. And in social enterprise, in this definition, it is at non-profit maximizing. So that's also up to discussion. So this was their take on it. But we heard it earlier on this morning that yes, it is difficult. It takes a lot of time. You have to protect your value chain. So you're not maximizing your own profit, but you're sharing it with the low-income population. And another example is that primary funding type, whereas for an inclusive business model, it is the market, it is the stock exchange, it is the bonds, it is the commercial banks. Also for the inclusive business activities and in social enterprise initiatives, it is mixed. They're looking for grants, looking for patient capital, looking for low-interest loans, and trying to make it happen. The other thing is sort of been around, and I think it's important as a framework of analysis, is this inclusive business ecosystem framework. So who are the stakeholders who are touching your business? The business itself, but also around. So we've got the governments and all the different agencies, and you have to have a look how it affects your business and how they can possibly support you. And I will come back to this a little bit later, because this is like a tool one could use to actually find out what are the differences it needs for a social enterprise and for an inclusive business. So what G20 came up with in terms of the requirements for this ecosystem is the recognition that governments have a key role to play. And this was a discussion earlier, and I think we had yesterday, what can the government do? Definitely the enabling environment is something that has to be set up. It has a lot of players in this enabling environment, but the government has a role, an important role to play. To set it up. So what can they do? They can review existing regulation. That could be in banking. The Philippines is a fantastic example of having regulation for microfinance institutions. It's globally recognized as having one of the best regulations for MFIs in the world. And people come here to have a look at it. and it also was part why the MFIs are prospering in this country. You're putting pro-poor targets into government activities, and the example that she cited in the G20 document is Manila Water, who had some obligation to connect the informal settlements into the pipes they were laying out for the water. So you can also look at, I think there was one discussion, what kind of legal structure could you give to a social enterprise? There are examples in the US and also in Europe where a specific legal structure has been defined and set up, which has certain advantages to you if you have a social impact in your mission. And the enhancing financial resources and providing financial incentives, and we had that discussion before as well. Whereas like direct financial incentives is definitely difficult, as we have heard. However, the access to financial resources is something that government or government institutions can do. And I'm just thinking about like Land Bank, for example, has developed together with Panama Foods a specific loan product for cacao farmers, which takes into consideration the company, sector, and crop-specific needs and requirements of a coconut farmer, such as the amount of money he needs, the holiday in repayment it requires for the cacao plant to grow for 2 years, and then get the first harvest. So this is something that many government-owned institutions like Land Bank or Development Bank of the Philippines can take over. Again, here is for the BOP, the access to finance, providing information and awareness raising, especially among the government institutions, but also among the universities, that there are inclusive business or social enterprises out there and what they can do for the inclusive growth agenda. And strengthening the capacity. An example here is given on vocational training, was given on the private sector, working together with the private sector. And one example there is that livelihood activities of the Department of Social Welfare, part of the 4P program, has enormous funds available for livelihood. And there is certainly an opportunity to work with the private sector to employ those funds in a sustainable way. Another example is the National Greening Program, where now our corporations not only planting trees, but planting productive trees such as coffee or cacao, and then working with the inclusive businesses such as Panama Foods or Rocky Mountain to make this whole greening program sustainable, and not that if a new funder comes, the small trees are ripped out again and replanted, something that we had seen in the past. So the other way this tool can be used is actually to look at all these stakeholders and see what do you want from it. And this is where inclusive business and social enterprise have a few things in common, but they have a few things which are really different. In terms of financing, if you're an inclusive business and you have a big operation, you're looking for a lot of money. So you would be approaching, for example, Armin and the Asian Development Bank. Armin is going to tell you, well, if you need less than, was it now 50 million, 20 million, 10 million, we can't really talk to you, because this is the minimum that we can give. If you talk to impact investors, some of them say our minimum is 2 million. So you have to look at what kind of financial institution is the right one for you and what are your right ways. But there are a lot of communalities as well, and this is where inclusive business and social enterprise have a lot in common and can share their advocacy. So the other thing that I would like to highlight is the work that we've been doing with the Board of Investment and the Asian Development on accreditation. So this has been sort of mentioned before as well. What can DTI do, what it can't do. I think it's time for that social enterprise discussion with DTI and our discussion on inclusive business to come together and to start looking at a common accreditation to then take this forward. So what we have done, we have looked at the key concepts, and this is work that has started in 2013 with the Philippine Water Investment, again with Sasas Group and Yusek Reyes, to install a process where you can identify inclusive businesses. We have piloted it now with about 20 companies. And what it did, it took the key concepts and tried to then put that down into real numbers and the qualitative and quantitative analysis of the business model. So some of the highlights of this accreditation is that it is sector specific. So we are looking at the moment at agribusiness, housing, and tourism, but it has to be done for each sector because each sector has different benchmarks for in terms of reach, in terms of depth. Also the business models will be very different from a company that does an inclusive business in housing from one in cacao. So this has to be taken into consideration. It also has to be country specific. Like we started here in the Philippines with about 100 million people. So in terms of scale, you're talking about 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 to be material. The Tajikistan has now also started to get interested in inclusive business. It's a country with 8 million people. So obviously the scale for this country is very different from the one here in the Philippines. And the tool that we developed is a weighted average, so we looked at all the different criteria and gave it a certain weight. And it is ex ante, so we are looking at it, what the company will do in the future. What is their business model? What are their targets? What do they want to achieve in the next 3 to 5 years? And then this is evaluated based on the business model and then later on verified. And the result of this exercise is a score that gives you an indication whether a company is rather does not have an inclusive business model, it has a potential to have an inclusive business model, or it already is an inclusive business model. So just sort of breaking down the concept now into our piloting. We've looked at the key concept of financial viability. The criteria is profitability, the return on equity that we looked at. And then we put in a benchmark. And this was done together with management associations, academia, to see what is like a non-relevant, a low, a medium, and a higher return in this industry. And then, depending on where the company falls in this benchmark, they're giving a rating between 0 and 6. Then this criteria was weighted, so out of 100%, it was given a weight of 3%, and then it gave a score depending on where they scored, and all these scores were then added up to then give the final score. So this explains to you how we come from a very high level definition of commercially viable onto something that you can measure. So and then I want to quickly talk about these sort of different criteria that we have come up with. In terms of financial performance, we looked at the company level, and then we looked at the inclusive business case itself. In terms of social impact, we looked at reach, so how many people, and then we looked also at full-time, part-time, so it's a little bit more sophisticated than just saying how many overall. We looked at the depth, and there we looked at, in this case, it's agribusiness, so we're looking at job and income generation, so what is your income increase? And we looked at the business model itself. So we looked at what makes a business model in agricultural environment inclusive. And the common 4 things that we found is the security of the contract, it's your access to technical assistance, is the access to land, and the access to finance. And for example, if you look at presentation of Kennemers and others, these are the things that they note, which actually increases the farmer's income that they work with. So we're looking at those criteria. Systemic change, this is something that sort of echoes what has been discussed before lunch, is that we gave extra points or a higher weight to companies that are working in the poorest areas. So we're looking at the poverty index of municipalities and regions, and then see if you are in a high poverty area, your score is higher than somebody who has activities in a lower, in a low poverty area. The other thing is on the relevance to the sector. Does it have the potential to transform the sector? The cacao industry was non-existent in this country before Canada came. Now Canada come, and within 2 years they have developed the biggest nursery worldwide for cacao plants. And this will trigger a lot of other companies to come in. So this is going to revitalize the industry. Rocky Mountain, very similar. The main purpose of the Philippine Coffee Association has been to import coffee. And then so roast it here and sell it. Now the emphasis is more on developing quality coffee in the country. And then we're looking at innovation. So what are your measures in your business that increases your profitability and your governance? Social impact, what are your other things you're doing to increase inclusiveness? And on environment. So how environmentally friendly are you? This is also, and this is where the weighting comes in, this is more important, for example, agribusiness, which has a profound impact on your environment. Then, for example, if you look at inclusive business model in education, where your impact will be rather limited. So when we looked at this criteria, this is a discussion that we had within the BOI to say, well, can't we use this tool also for social enterprises? And when we're looking at the different sort of areas of the tool, the different parts, the key concept stays the same, the criteria stays the same, the rating, weight, and score can stay the same. What needs to be changed is the benchmark. For example, if you allow a social enterprise to have a lower profitability and still get a high rating. So by changing the benchmark, you can actually move a company towards a higher score or a lower score. So our suggestion was that we are working specifically with a benchmark to then give social enterprises a chance to have a high rating and be then accredited as a social enterprise in this scheme. So this would bring, and this was the topic of the talk, how do you bring inclusive business and social enterprise together? You can develop this accreditation tool and actually use it for inclusive businesses and social enterprises. The one sort of interesting fact was when we started developing this tool that it brought a lot of clarity, not only to the BOI and people concerned about it, but also about the companies. Because companies were not quite sure, are we an inclusive business? When I started working in this field in 2012 for the first study on inclusive business in the Philippines, nobody heard about that term before. So we went out and said, oh yeah, we're working with poor people. Okay, then you start, okay, how do you do that? Do you just buy from them and you don't care? No, we go out, we help them, we provide technical finance, technical assistance, and so on. So we started to developing this discussion. And when we did our piloting now with the 20 companies, that discussion was much more profound because we can look at these different criteria and tell them, okay, for you to be successful in inclusive business, in agribusiness, you have to have a very good technical assistance program to your farmers, because this will increase the yield, it will increase the quality, and this way you will benefit, but also the farmer will benefit. So it also helps us to move away from this endless discussion on definitions. By saying, okay, these are our criteria, then it even becomes to a lawmaker or the executive much more easier to understand what we are talking about, rather than having a high-level definition where the tendency is to put everything in because you don't want to exclude anybody, but then it becomes so wishy-washy that a lawmaker says, well, then you include everybody who has a business or an MSME or whatever in your social enterprise definition. So this helps actually to bring clarity to the discussion. And then it can provide the basis for policy incentives, and that's still work in progress for BOI and other government agencies, what we heard before. It's being developed, it's still in discussion what will follow out of it. What we have aimed for in the beginning for inclusive business was not so much a tax incentive, because that's a very steep goal. But there's a lot of other things DTI can do and other government agencies can do to help inclusive businesses and social enterprises. For example, you can look at the programs you have anyway. And the DTI has this fantastic shared service facility. It is about 700 million peso. And like with many government programs, you have these funds at the central government, and they are going to be spent directly at the farmer or cooperative level. The private sector is not part of this direct connection, because previously the private sector was not interested to work with the farmers. Now you've got these inclusive businesses that say, hey, we are interested to work with the farmers, can we somehow be included? So this was one way of actually including social enterprises and inclusive businesses in government programs by seeing where can they add value to the program, where can they add sustainability to my program. And then in these implementing rules, include them. So it's far easier to do something like this than aiming to have a new bill and asking for subsidies or tax incentives. And that's actually something that the companies we talk to appreciate very much. So we see there's some low-hanging fruits. We just need somebody to pick them. So as I said, it's work in progress, but what I believe in is if social enterprises and inclusive businesses join forces, this push will become much more powerful than it will be, or than it is at the moment, where it's like two separate strands talking to different people and having difficulties getting results. So this would be like my appeal to moving forward, a suggestion for the next steps, to actually join forces and take this discussion forward together, and then have some real outcomes and not only papers that we have seen. We've seen many papers and many versions of bills and accreditation. So with this, thank you very much, and I look forward to the Q&A later.